Also, was hilarious to see the totally non-snowflake reaction on X to your comments calling UFC a right-wing sport. Guys, can I? Oh my lord, can I just tell you something? This is what I referenced at the beginning of the show. I am not sure how to talk about this because I have been embroiled in a number of controversies based on things I've said or witnessed to or associated with. And sometimes the response to the things I said yielded, either criticism or pushback, or in certain cases, firestorm of controversy in ways that, really, at least if for no other reason than to like really say, okay, let's wait a second. What are they saying here? And is there something to it? And at times, sort of thinking critically about what I had said and whether or not that was correct. And maybe I made the adjustments that people wanted me to, and maybe I didn't. That is a separate conversation. But at least, I took a moment to be like, okay, what's happening here? And let's inventory that. And by the way, I don't think this will be the last controversy I'm embroiled in. If you guys didn't see it, there was like this aggregator account on Twitter who took just a small portion, I think like a 2-minute portion of my conversation with DJ, where I said MMA has become, or UFC, or I have to go back and look at the quote exactly, but MMA essentially has become an aggressively right-wing sport, which is like quite fucking obviously true. This is not even debatable, right? But it had this like enormous reaction. And the reaction to me was, at least for like a day or two, bewildering. Because the reaction was denial that was true. Well, there's a few different reactions, but one of the big ones was that this is not true. That you could not make a claim that yet MMA and under the UFC's leadership has become a right-wing sport. And I'm going to try. Okay. I do not imagine that if I list the evidence for that in this video, although I might try, that this will have some kind of very convincing appeal to people, in part because if the avalanche of evidence for that claim that we have been living under all this time is invisible to them, I do not imagine my recitation of it after the fact is going to be convincing, right? So I think we're dealing with a situation where there is this like overwhelming evidence for something, and yet you're getting this very harsh reaction to the mere observance of these facts. So it's not like I think that saying this is going to change the world. I don't think that, but I'm going to try and afford to others what was, if you look at the comment thread, what was not really afforded to me, which is I'm going to try and do this without being insulting, but I have to caution that it's actually quite difficult to do that because of how easy this argument is to make. I mean, imagine if somebody asked you to make the opposite argument. Imagine if someone tasked you, like you showed up to like a debate team thing, and someone was like, make the argument that the UFC is a left-wing sport. And in fact, these were your two choices. One team has to promote that MMA and UFC is a left-wing sport, and one has to promote it's a right-wing sport. Which case would you rather argue? Sort of a general proposition. This is not evidence of anything per se, but just to kind of lay this out, I would much rather make the one about it being right-wing because the overwhelming evidence is on your side. In fact, it is so overwhelming, I'm not even sure where to begin. But I suppose we can start. There is nothing that the UFC has done as an organization to say explicitly, hey, this is a right-wing organization and this is for right-wing people and that's what we are, right? They've not made a kind of broad declaration about it. But they don't really need to. Understand a couple of things that have happened, just as like, again, we're going to set the context here. I have gone on pretty big media outlets this year, New York Times, Rolling Stone, The Daily Show, CNN, they were all asking me to talk to them because they were trying to understand how the UFC had gotten so right wing and so MAGA aligned. Like the premise of the conversation was that, for example, The Daily Show, they did a special called MAGA, the Next Generation. Do you know where they went? They went to a Charlie Kirk rally. This is obviously pre his assassination. And then they went to a UFC event. They didn't go anywhere else. They didn't go to NASCAR. They didn't go to college football. They didn't go to any of those things. They went to a UFC event because, as they told me, and as we discussed on the episode, it's like the epicenter of what you would consider to be the bleeding edge of the marriage between, MAGA sort of aligned worlds and sports. Like that's the nexus. I'm trying to point out to you, I would not have had these opportunities to talk to these outlets and then be on TV about them, but for the fact that the rest of the world, the English speaking world, certainly in this part of the country anyway, all views this as like an obvious fact of life. The entire way in which and you could say, well, I don't agree with their framing, and that's fine, but at a bare minimum, there is clear, at a bare minimum, there's dispute over how to interpret the set of facts that have befallen us the last few years. And I can fucking assure you that outside of the MMA bubble, the overwhelming opinion is that it's right coded, MAGA aligned, and that a vector for right-wing politics. Like that is the view. That is absolutely 100% the view outside of the MMA bubble. I know a lot of people inside of the MMA bubble really kind of reject that anyone else would be able to have a say about it, but they do. That's the world that we live in. And I just want to be clear, like the biggest media opportunities I've had are all premised on that reality. Okay. Even putting that aside, what would be the evidence for this? Well, there's a few things you could point to going all the way back. And by the way, when did this all get set in? I think it really ramped up the last couple of years, but it's kind of been set in motion in different ways. It kind of trickled out a little bit in 2016 when Dana White made an endorsement at the Republican National Convention. It kind of really took on another life, I think, during the pandemic and over some of those COVID battles. But I think it really got going, frankly, from 2022-ish, really 2023-ish, when Donald Trump was indicted, and then that Saturday after he was indicted, they brought him back to UFC events. And then, of course, after he won, there was the sort of celebratory lap in New York City. But I just want to be clear about this. The guy, okay, so first of all, Trump has been visible at like numerous UFC events, not just as president. People are like, oh, they're having presidents over. They had him as a candidate. And they had him as a candidate after he was indicted for serious crimes, which I realize those cases have gone away, but only because he won the election. Like if he hadn't, there's a good chance we'd be in a very, very different place on the merits, particularly for the documents case. Understand something too. Donald Trump's polling is stable but low. He is deeply, deeply, deeply unpopular to a large portion of this country. And they trot him out, and especially not less so these days, obviously, because he's president, but at a time when he was candidate, they were trotting him out all the time, right? He was going to event after event as candidate, getting a walkout, getting this treatment of adoration from the fighter. So they're all kind of playing a role here. But let's get down to brass tacks. Dude, Trump's own campaign strategists both viewed in the 2020 election and the 2024 election, they viewed fighters as important campaign surrogates in key swing states, in places like Arizona, which is not a swing state, but that was an important one they wanted to win. But in Florida, in particular, they use these guys with their own kind of messaging, their own kind of backdrop, their own kind of special guests, their own events. This is all documented. They had singled out that the fighters would be great campaign surrogates for them in these particular states. Not just that, there is campaign documents that show that they viewed UFC fans who often, and this might sound familiar, view themselves as apolitical, but can be fashioned in such a way as to see Trump as some kind of fighter in this kind of resistance to woke sort of ideas or pressures as a kind of resistance to this, right? I'm going to ask a very basic question through all of this. Show me which other sports organization or any other commensurate effort in MMA where this equivalent exists on the left. Yeah, sometimes when Obama shows up to basketball games, they let him wave at the beginning of the game and then they're off again. That's not the same as showing a political candidate, especially one who was indicted for federal crimes, and doing this over and over again, and having the fighters of the organization as well as the fans themselves spotlit as ways to be useful for the campaign purposes. This doesn't even exist in any capacity whatsoever as a left-wing equivalent in this sport or any other. You have Steve Bannon, a king of Trump world, openly telling people to watch UFC, QAnon Telegram channels. This is all, everything I'm telling you is fully documented, telling people to watch UFC. Candace Owens saying UFC is the only real sport left. She had Benil Dariush on to discuss the harms of communism together. Show me what the equivalent is of the other side doing this in MMA. What's the left-wing equivalent of any of these, right? Because it'd be one thing if like none of this was happening and it was just we're not having this discussion because there's not anything of any kind of political import really being involved. That's one thing that's happening, that could be happening, but it's not. Or the other way this could go is there's a right-wing version of this, but there's also like a left-wing portion of the fan base that's doing something along these lines and having these same kinds of effect, and it's all a bit of a wash. Neither of those things are happening. You have key figures. The assistant to President Trump, Stephen Chung, used to work at UFC. Dana White gave $1 million to a Trump super PAC in 2020. Tucker Carlson, Kid Rock show up to UFC events. Elon Musk, Speaker of the House, parts of the Trump cabinet showing up to UFC events. Again, what would be the non-Republican equivalent of this happening at all at any point in the MMA world? Guys, they're doing Let's Go Brandon chants at UFC events. In Canada. In fact, let's talk about that as well. You had Jair Bolsonaro appoint MMA fighters as ambassadors to various cultural not like to other countries, but to cultural activities that they wanted to promote. Which fine, that's not by itself all that interesting. But like they came out heavy in support of Bolsonaro when he was running for re-election, and when he tried to deny the election results, Devison Figueiredo famously on a WhatsApp channel encouraged a military takeover to keep Bolsonaro in power. Then when Bolsonaro fled, whose house did he stay in? Jose Aldo's. You have not just this, but now also this Manosphere connection where multiple MMA fighters are seen hobnobbing with, the Tate brothers, Dana White himself welcoming them. And I'm going to keep asking, show me the left-wing equivalent of these things happening so that it can be all in the wash. It doesn't exist. More to the point, if you have watched this live chat, we've been discussing this as like a basic fact of existence for years. Show of hands from folks who watched the live chat. How many times have I told you about the number of emails I've gotten from people being like, I can't do this shit anymore. I can't deal with the Trump fawning. I can't deal with the connection to the Manosphere. I can't deal with whatever things that they didn't like about its association and relationship to the right-wing, growing right-wing kind of overtaking things. There is clear political alignment both between the right-wing world and MMA, as well as clear connectivity bridges that explain the alignment as well as advocacy for direct political efforts, even if you're not even looking at the presidential election. Governor DeSantis in Florida held a rally at fucking ATT. Once again, what is the left-wing equivalent of this happening in the sport? It doesn't fucking exist. The one thing you can show would be Kevin years ago supporting Bernie, but in the most recent presidential election, he recommended Trump. And that's the closest thing you can think of. I have been met with email after email, DMs after DMs. I've documented this in previous articles I've written and actually showed clips of them, of people saying to me, I'm out. I can't do it. What has happened is there's been a quiet exodus of left-wing fans or people who are just otherwise turned off by the various things that the sport has become associated with. And there's a bunch of people, it appears to the best of what I can tell, inside of the sport, largely unaware of this. It is, you'll notice that in political times, if your team is in power, it's very easy to not notice their flaws. It actually takes a lot of work for people who are aligned to see failures in that way. However, can the opposing team see all their flaws? Every time, right? So you might even argue, well, the people who don't like it, they're having a hyper focus on all this. But I would say that there's two sides to that coin, which is maybe you disagree with the fact that they shouldn't see things this way, but you're not seeing them at all. The UFC's rightward turn is not merely unambiguous. It is, in my judgment, intentional. And in fact, it's not even me saying that there's going to be some kind of long-term consequence. Once more, if you've watched this live chat before, I'm not about to say anything you haven't heard. It's an intentional pivot that may actually work long-term. Because the pivot is we are no longer an open tent sport for as many people as possible. We're going to narrow the scope of that. But here's the catch. And the catch is that the people that we have, we're going to build more durable relationships to, because we're going to be much more of a politically aligned brand, an ideologically aligned brand, kind of a lifestyle aligned brand, all of that kind of world, associated world, and this cultural interplay between the right and MMA. We're going to take advantage of that because that is more durable and that's going to last. And they might be right. They might be right. Not to say that I like the turn that the product has taken, but as a proposition, will that work? It might. It genuinely might. We don't know because we've never really seen a brand go to this extent to promote a political candidacy and the associated movement, as well as other associated movements in conjunction with that, so unambiguously. Dude, Jair Bolsonaro is friends with Jose Aldo. As I mentioned, in Canada, who'd you have that guy? Polyev goes to a UFC event, gets cheered. There's fuck Trudeau chants, which fine, he was unpopular at the time. But then, as I mentioned, there were Let's Go Brandon chants in Canada. In Canada. Someone might respond and say, doesn't that to some extent show that there's probably a right-leaning perspective to MMA and combat sport? Well, I don't know about boxing, but certainly in MMA, isn't there something to be said for that? And the answer is yes, something I've never denied. I've never denied. It in general leans that way and probably always has, and to the extent that it will survive, probably always will, right? I don't think that's crazy to say. But there's been A, more revealed preferences. B, there's been more ideological homogenization as it's pushed out people who cannot get on board with, again, I'm not asking people who are watching this to say you have to agree with me about all the various things that I like or don't like. But what I am asking you to consider is Trump is deeply polarizing, deeply polarizing. It is, to people who don't like him, nauseating to watch him get trotted out at UFC events. And it has been a force for exodus for people who don't like that kind of a thing. And the fact that I have hundreds, if not thousands at this point, of emails to that effect, again, I don't think they're the majority by any stretch, but they're gone. The majority of them are gone. There might be some who are left who are like, hey, I just want to watch fights. Hey, kind of. I mean, I'm not saying I'm exactly like that, but people like me still exist in part. Dude, when that firestorm hit, do you know what I got? I got two kinds of DM types. One kind of DM type was like, hey, fuck you, libtard, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, this doesn't exactly disprove the thesis that I was making. I have to tell you that, like, if there's a bunch of insults about a political ideology that you don't like, I know a lot of people fashion themselves like, hey, I'm apolitical, but then when you really interrogate it, that's most the number one guy is the guy who's like, I'm neither left nor right. 100% of the time, that guy's right wing. Like 100% of the time. There's a lot of that going on, but then you just look down that thread and it's just a bunch of people insulting the left. This doesn't disprove my thesis, but the other kind of letter that I got, the other part that I got, were people who were saying to me from the other side, being like, oh my God, thank you for speaking out. Even though I wasn't even trying to speak out, it just got kind of turned into that. They don't want to say anything. A, there's hardly any of them left. And B, they don't want to say anything because they don't want to get yelled at like I got yelled at, where now you're having to get ugly DMs and there's people saying horrible shit about you on the internet. They just don't even want to fucking deal with that shit. But I am trying to, here. Let's try this, shall we? Let's try this. Okay. All right. Look here. I just typed in UFC MAGA, right? Okay. Skip the stupid ass AI overview from there. Just look at what everyone is saying. Just look. Patriotic, macho, and anti-woke. UFC is a haven for, let's see, what do they say? A haven for the MAGA mindset. Okay. Has MMA always been conservative in MAGA? How UFC head Dana White became the glue between what? What did he become the glue between? The MAGA and Manosphere. Attending UFC events is key for Trump to reach his political voting bloc. How the UFC went MAGA. The MAGAification of sports continues. Donald Trump's UFC stunt is more than a circus. And here's one for me, believe it or not. Mainstream media. Oh, look, this is me. This is when I went on CNN. Here, let me stop that. Mainstream media is finally curious about the UFC MAGA connection. This is from Sports Politica, whatever. CNN, UFC boss Dana White says he's done with politics. Okay, but you're already in him. From whoever. Trump's impromptu dance at UFC event draws MAGA frenzy. Donald Trump's UFC victory party in New Yorker. Trump and MAGA picks attend UFC fight. From the coach of Poetan. Congratulations, Donald Trump. Daily Beast, Trump and Musk making it a UFC fight in Miami. UFC reporter has rare moment of clarity after taking pushback from, this is about, Nina and Sean Strickland. Trump enters UFC 14 to roaring crowd and MAGA cheers. Donald Trump joined by Elon Musk in MAGA entourage. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, guys, what is the equivalent? Even if you want to deny that this has political valence, which I just don't even know how you could do, but what is the left-wing equivalent of this where you could say, well, it's all kind of a wash in MMA? This is the only thing that's happening. The fighters who come out and talk about politics only ever talk about right-wing politics. The folks who come out and talk publicly about support for Donald Trump or whose candidate they like, they only ever do it for Donald Trump. The leaders who are engaged in this are only doing it for right-wing causes. The chants from the crowd are only right-wing chants. The expanse of this through the entire Western Hemisphere only goes in one direction. And it has ramped up. No, let's go back. Hold on. Look. How UFC 303, how MMA explains the UFC. Trump is the UFC and Dana White's new favorite politician. Dana White, Donald Trump, and the rise of cage, what do they call it? The rise of cage match politics. Guys, this fucking idea that I'm out of my mind, that I'm just imagining something, it is amazing to me that people have the fucking temerity to tell me that I live in an information bubble. Boys and girls, I have terrible news for you. It is not me. For the ones who disagree with the thesis that I made, it is you. Your powers of observation are poor. And I'm not even telling you that you have to agree. Oh, well, look at those articles. It's from Daily Beast and New Yorker and New York Times and Vox. Fine. You don't have to like them. One more time. Where are the political candidates lining up with MMA fighters in swing states to affect young men as a voting bloc? Where is Hassan Piker at UFC events? Which fighters are going on left wing politics? Which MMA leaders are speaking for left wing candidates? Which gubernatorial candidates are holding for on the left are holding events in MMA gyms? Which podcasts on the left feature MMA fighter? I could go on and fucking on and do. Guys, it's raining outside and you're trying to tell me the sun is shining. What is happening is there's a lot of people who, again, is it a valid perspective to say, hey, I'm an MMA fan, I just care about fights, and yeah, I kind of recognize this right wing, or I don't even give a fuck, I just want to see fights. That's a valid perspective because there's a core of fight fans who are always going to feel that way, and I understand that. I totally get it. But it just seems to me that there's a lot of people who are thinking that like the UFC going away from, and again, you're asking like, didn't NFL or NBA go to like a woke direction? They certainly did. And I think part of what the reason the UFC went the other way is to get away from that. And folks see that as like a realignment to order. And it might have been if it had just been that. But that's not all it's been. A political candidate of deep polarization getting that kind of treatment with all of these other actors in the space donating their time, their celebrity, and their money to activate these causes at the grassroots level and more broadly, media acolytes, electorate representatives, all up and down the food chain. Dude, MMA is a fucking right-wing sport now. And it probably has always leaned to the right. That is true. But it has become significantly more explicit. And frankly, when I say exploitable, I mean they're trying to make more active use of those resources in order to leverage certain outcomes that they want. This is not up for debate. Everything I've shown you, there is no left-wing equivalent at all in the sport. It's either nothing, some level of neutrality where we're not even involved in these things, or to the extent there's any kind of political involvement, it's that. So this was what has like when that Twitter thing blew up, I was just like, I'm not even sure what to say about this. How could I ever walk back reality as such? It would be absurd to even try. And it's absurd to argue. There's no other equivalent to everything I have shown you in any way, even a little bit to the other side. And there's no sport, even if we're not even talking about MMA, who's done this kind of a thing and has this kind of a relationship to a political party in the way that the UFC does. And it's not, the reason why we know this is it's not accidental. I think they made a choice. And by the way, as I mentioned, last thing on this, part of it is, there's a ideological homogeneity. I made this point, like I was there when Jorge Masvidal fought Nate Diaz and Trump came. Remember, it was MSG and it was like boos and cheers. People were like, oh, he got nothing but booed. That's not true. He got booed and cheered, but it was a mix, right? It was a mix. Then he, spins the block and he comes back at 309 and it's like this rapturous applause. And it's like, oh, well, people just changed their minds about him. No, dude. No. The fan base changed. They changed. And so to me, in retrospect, it actually does make a lot of sense that there was this outsized reaction because there's a lot of people who are right wing. I thought they would like take credit for it, but I think they sort of see it like I'm saying that they're acting in some kind of sinister way, which I'm really not. I'm saying this is just where we are, fellas. Fellas, this is just where we are. We are at a place where key leadership spends their time in a political alignment, promoting of candidacies, promoting of various elections. The UFC made a combatant and chief documentary about Donald Trump. The evidence is overwhelming. But for people on the right who I think feel like this is some kind of an attack, even though it's, I mean, I don't like the way the sport has gone, but the observation that it's gone that way itself is not an attack. Or there's a lot of people who are like, well, I'm not left or right. Brother, you're right. You're right. You're right wing. It's okay. Just admit it, but that's what you are. But like, again, good faith challenge. What on earth would be the argument that it's not right wing? What would be the argument that there is this menagerie of different viewpoints? If all the folks who could have given those viewpoints have left the sport and you just take it, well, no one seems to be advocating for these ideas anymore. I guess we all just agree and we're all the same now. But no, the fabric of the sport changed. You have to be able to see this. You have to. This is a basic feature of reality. And as I indicated, not only do they have, I think, a fan base who they might have long-term a tighter relationship to, look at the dividends it yields now with them trying to get the Ali Act changed, or however you want to describe it, the new law, well, the new bill passed. Like, this is all a function of making an explicit pivot politically to get these kinds of political rewards. The UFC White House event is a political reward for the UFC, helping him. Oh, here, look. How about this? How about this? I mean, I just can't believe people would do this. Watch. Here, let me. Here. UFC help elect Trump. What do we get? From BBC World Service, did WWE and UFC help Donald Trump win the election? From Fox 4 Dallas, UFC Dana White's full speech, Fox 9. This is okay, that's a little different. From CNN, UFC boss Dana White. Okay, that's a different one we saw. Here, Sportico. MMA won the election, says the UFC co-creator. Again, Donald Trump's victory party. Here's the fucking co-creator, Campbell McLaren, I'm assuming. Right? Yup. Campbell McLaren, what does he say? Remember, I'm a promoter, so I'm allowed a certain amount of hyperbole, blah, blah, blah. But in 30 years, the sport has gone from being an outcast sport. Fast forward, UFC and Dana White, and certainly Joe Rogan, played an enormous part in Donald Trump's popularity, particularly with young men. Need I even talk about the Joe Rogan element in all of this? I'm not even going to get to that. I don't need to. I cannot imagine a world where you can review this kind of evidence. Again, not merely to this country, hemispheric, all the way from Canada down to Brazil, with overt, and by the way, Bolsonaro would use fighters for his own rallies as well, and come to the conclusion that this is a sport that is, equally amounted, or roughly equally amounted left or right, or that it hasn't taken, express decisions in ways and moved in certain ways by the leadership and the rank and file to make it a political vehicle for right-wing causes. It quite obviously has. From presidential elections in Brazil to the governor of Florida to a lot of spaces in between, this is just the reality. It is insane to argue otherwise. It is insane. You cannot claim that you have respectable levels of powers of observation, and you cannot draw this inference. Something is, you either are not being honest with yourself, or there's something damaged about your ability to, and I'm not trying to be mean, but there's something damaged about your ability to perceive reality. This is done. It's like the turn has been made. The question only now is what happens as a consequence. And your guess is certainly as good as mine. And as I indicated, last thing I'm going to say on this, as I indicated, it may work. It may actually work. In which case you can be like, that was a good decision. You might actually be able to say in 5 to 10 years, it was a good decision that they did that. Those other leagues that didn't kind of find that like binding power in that way to their own audience, they missed the boat. UFC got it right. That's actually a conversation that we might be able to have. But what we cannot have is a conversation that this is a sport that is neutral. And the outsized reaction and the hostility to me suggesting it, despite the fucking mountain of evidence to the contrary, indicates that I touched a nerve. I touched a nerve. I touched a nerve on people who don't want to accept it, who cannot accept it, or are somewhat in denial about it because they kind of see me as maybe being on the left, obviously, and then this is some kind of an attack. It's not an attack, brothers and sisters. It's just, it's like, I can't attack this fact any more than I can attack the sun for shining or the rain for falling. It just is a fact of reality now. The die is cast. And I hope that, again, I don't imagine that this will be maximally convincing, but I hope that there is at least somebody who can hear this and see some of this stuff, get out of the MMA bubble. What is the rest of the world saying about MMA? Not that you have to agree with it, but where are their views? And they are coming down decidedly in the place that it's made a turn for the right. Dude, look at Connor's whole thing, anti-immigrant, bozo-ass right-wing thing that he did, the grift that he did in Ireland. Like, it extends all the way over there too. By the way, last thing on this UFC White House thing, this is why people are saying, yeah, this is not about Trump. This is a neutral event. Dude, they're putting it on his fucking birthday. It's going to be a level of magnification and glorification of him on the likes of which you've never seen. And people will still probably say this is just a neutral event about the presidency, because I think that they're genuinely incapable of understanding how the rest of the world perceives this thing.